Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. More people may be trickling in and really appreciate all of you gathering here. I know it's been a long day and we are now at our final session of the afternoon. So as folks are coming in, it would be great if you could put your name and your school that you represent in the chat so we can know where everyone's from, and if you've graduated, I say perhaps where you're living now or what you've been doing now in addition to your school. That would be terrific. Also, if there's any other visitors, other guests, please put your names and affiliations in the chat as well. This is the first panel that I've been moderating this 2021 Washington weekend, and it's just been terrific to hear from so many of your colleagues earlier today and yesterday. My name is Ann Peters, and I'm the University and Community Outreach Director. And as a reminder, we'll be recording this session so that we can post it online later. And our session is titled Global Human Rights 1. So the first of a two-part series on global human rights. Our icebreaker for this session, if you could put in the chat, where are you most looking forward to traveling for work or pleasure post-pandemic? We won't get into timelines, just a couple of places that you want to go, even if it's just your nearby, museum, wherever that might be. That'd be great to hear. Again, we're recording this session so we can post it online later. We also encourage you to tweet and use the hashtag Pulitzer Weekend 21. We also have the social media packet that our colleagues have created with all of the reporting fellow handles and school affiliations. So before we get into everyone's projects, just also want to introduce a few of my Pulitzer Center teammates here on this session. Welcome Lucy Crelly, who is live tweeting this session and has the beautiful backgrounds that she's created for us, if you want to add any of them today or tomorrow. And also behind the scenes, Alexis McCowan, who is producing this session, so a big shout out to her. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Zainab Ahmed, Emily Hayes, Taha Kalim, Hannah Lilly, Leanne Tibbet Mosby, and Rita Van Ant. And we'll be going in order, and they can talk to you, give you a sense of their work, and then we'll follow up with a discussion. And during that time, as you've probably sat in on a couple of these already, we'll go through some Q&As just by putting your name in the chat, and then we'll go on from there. So take notes, remember your questions, and hopefully we'll have a really good, lively discussion. So Zainab, shall we start with you?
Sure, I'll just share my screen. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my project is called Fun Inkilab, is the story of oppression, resistance, and art of Kashmir that came out of Kashmir after India occupied it officially on August 5th, 2019. The reporting topic and why is it relevant? I experienced the political lockdown of Kashmir firsthand on August 5th, 2019, before 5 days before I had to move to Chicago. And as an artist and art critique and art journalist, my mind went straight to, everybody was talking about the politics behind it and the impact of how it's going to impact the world politics, and how it's in the long run, how is it going to impact Kashmir? But my mind first went to the artist and how are they talking about it, and how are they going to how is it going to affect their art, and how is it going to affect their work? And it was about people who are still impacted by that lockdown and are going to for the rest of their lives, and to separate the politics and talk about the human condition of there and the mental and emotional consequences of that lockdown. And the crux of it was to understand the art that emerged from Kashmir after the political lockdown as a form of resistance, or as a form of the artists telling their own stories. uh, how did I held the interview and collected the data that I needed. It was mainly Zoom or phone calls. I tried Skype, but because the internet connection is still not really good there, it did not work out. So it was mainly over phone calls. I used tape recorder. I interviewed the artist on phone calls, and I recorded their interviews both on Zoom and on phone calls just to have better voices. I asked the artist to send me recordings of their work or their poems or their songs for using it in my podcast. Since I'm making a podcast, I'm not writing an article, I'm making a podcast. So I needed extra voices, extra sounds, and I asked the artist to send me these recordings. Who people that I have been talking to. Technically, it was supposed to be 6 artists, but 2 of my artists backed out. So I have 3 artists and 1 journalist as of now. Um, Syed Mustafa Rizvi, he's a painter. He's currently working on art depicting the mental health crisis the Kashmir lockdown caused. He started a small art gallery called Art Quest and an art cafe prior to the lockdown. But after the lockdown, he had to migrate from Chennai. Uh, he had to migrate from Kashmir to Chennai, so South India after 2019. While I was talking to him, he said something really important, and I have used quotes of most of the artists that I have talked to. The quotes that were really powerful or that hit me personally. He said we were teleported to a time when there was no cellular service or internet, or everything I created collapsed overnight, and that sums up the lockdown in one of the most haunting ways that I could. Then there's Masood Hussain. He's a digital artist. He's currently working on a project called Children of Conflict, uh, which documents the children affected by the pellet guns that Indian Army used on civilians, or in general the Kashmir conflict. He lost most of his work in a flood in Kashmir in 2019. Post that, he started working as a digital artist, and he calls his work as a documentation of the oppression. He said documenting and recording the atrocities of the Indian occupation is the least an artist can do, and it is his personal form of resistance. Then there's Zishan Jaipuri. He's a poet. He writes about Indian occupation of Kashmir and the Kashmiri Intifada revolution. His art was originated after he lost his childhood friend and neighbor to the Indian occupation while he was 13. And after that, he started writing poetry. Initially, the poetry was full of uh, anger, and but still there was hope. But he said it was always about resistance. However, after 2019, you can just sense the hopelessness and numbness in my poetry, and it's a collective trauma of the entire Kashmir that my poetry talks about. Then there's Qazi Shibli. I'm using Qazi as an expert in my podcast because I needed somebody to also talk about the political impact of the lockdown. And since he has been on ground and he is a journalist, who better than him? He was jailed for 9 months, a few days before the lockdown started, for cushioning the pre-clampdown chaos. He heard about the lockdown while he was in the jail. Then he was moved from Kashmir to a different state in India, and for 2 months he had no idea where he was. He was just locked down. He's still hounded by the Indian army and media for the stories he reports on. But amid all of this, he's still running a local Kashmiri media outlet called Kashmiriyat, and he's doing a good work. And he will be my expert in the podcast. He will be talking between the artists. He will be talking about uh, how this whole lockdown is going to affect and will continue affecting people. Uh, I asked him why was he uh, uh, arrested, and he said my crime, committing the crime of doing ethical journalism in occupied territory. And I think that is one of the best things or best quotes that I have personally heard as a journalist. I also talked to a few other journalists that I will be using, maybe not, I don't know. But I just wanted to get a clear picture of, or maybe fact checking of what Qazi was sharing was actually true, since I wasn't there on the ground. And most of the journalists who shared their stories resonated with Qazi's. So the challenges I faced were getting the artists to confide in me and open up about their personal stories, because since these people are coming from conflict zone and they have been through a lot. First there was political lockdown, and then there was pandemic, so it was really difficult for them to talk and open up about their personal stories. It took me around 6 to 7 tapes per artist to talk to them and get to know about their stories and their art. Also, artists have a tendency to talk about their art from a selling point. I think the worst description of an art somebody can give is the artist himself. So it took me really long to get to the point where they were not talking about their art from an artist's point of view, but from an audience point of view. Some of the artists never showed up, ghosted, or just backed out at the last minute. It was also really difficult to find women artists because two of my women artists actually backed out. Also, recording interviews on calls without any additional or unwanted background noise was a challenge, and it did not really happen. There were a lot of background noises. Getting hold of pictures or sounds I needed for my B-roll amid global pandemic was also difficult. Any advice I would pass on to anyone who's working on a similar project or doing remote reporting? Keep a planner because anything can happen last minute. People can back out. Time management is really difficult. It also takes quite some time for your subjects to trust you with their stories. So maybe I was told this, and I was advised that to have patience and open up first, like tell my story so that they can open up to you. Like, do not go to them as a journalist, but go to them as a human who has been through the same thing. uh, have a backup list prepared if in case any of the subjects backed out, and keep your interviews in loop about how the project is going, because they might expect something really immediate. So giving them a near clear idea of the timeline can be helpful for both you and them. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's in terms of challenges and tips. Really appreciate that. I'm really looking forward to your podcast.
Thank you.
Now let's move on to Emily.
Okay, yeah, Zainab, I'm really looking forward to your podcast as well, and thanks so much. I definitely have some questions for you too after this is over. But first, I want to say thank you to the Pulitzer Center for their patience with my project, because I waited until it was okay for me to travel to my destination country of Italy, and I really appreciate the Pulitzer Center's flexibility in that, because I was going to some very remote places, so it really made a difference in terms of being able to do the actual reporting. And it also, it makes it a challenge to report remotely. But I think, one of the things that I learned from this is just, to kind of make, take advantage of what you have. So I definitely had a lot more time to kind of read more about the topic that I wanted to report on. I read a lot of books about the topic. I also read books in the style of writing that I wanted to have my piece I'm writing an article. So I read a lot of books in terms of getting the style that I wanted to tell the story, and kind of seeing what was effective or what I thought was effective in terms of storytelling. So that was definitely something that I was grateful to have more time to do. So I'll go ahead and share my presentation. So I just have some photos that I wanted to share to kind of give everyone some images of what the place I was in kind of looked like. So I went to Molise in Italy, and there's a joke in Italy that Molise non esiste. It's not, it doesn't exist. No one lives there. It's a very small region, and it's also very remote. It's one of the most undeveloped places in Europe still. And my grandparents are actually from there. So I kind of already had some connections to the place because I had been to the general area that I was reporting on before, but not necessarily to the specific villages. So that was definitely helpful in terms of being able to speak the language, being able to speak the dialect, and being there and being able to kind of navigate. I was there for about 3 weeks. And so that kind of gave me a lot of time to make connections with people there. I know that, it can be challenging remotely and sometimes in person to make connections with the kind of people that you want to talk to. And when I was going into the project, I think I really tried to have a combination of doing the research, but also not to go into it with not such preconceived notions of what I wanted to get out of it, because you really want to go and listen to what the people have to say. Just because I did, I learned about the topic by going and seeing the place, visiting family, seeing, what was happening where they were living. So I kind of had their viewpoint on it, but I definitely wanted to go in listening to what people there had to say. And so Italy is a really unique place to report, because the people there, once they have a comfort level with you, they kind of, they're was so helpful, and everyone was so open, and especially the first village, and these are some photos of it. It was called Pizzone, and it's on this, it's a very mountainous region. And so when you drive through it, it's kind of like here, I think I have a photo. When you drive through the mountains, it kind of, each of the little villages is sitting on its own. Oh, maybe I didn't input it. Each of the little villages is sitting on its own kind of little mountain. And so they're all very, very distant from each other, very hard to get to. The road conditions are not great. But there's this tiny little village called Pizzone where there are 4 families that live there year round total. And there's about 300 people that live there in the summer that kind of return from the larger cities. And you can see here in this photo, there's signs of Vendesi, which means for sale. There's all these villages that in Italy, and the less developed, the less populated areas that are just being completely abandoned. They're empty. And I'm sure we've all read art. So this is, well, I'll get back to that. But so I just want to start clicking through the photos because I know we don't have a lot of time. But this is what the main street looks like. So it's beautiful, right? You know, it's well maintained. There's people that are living there. You know, it's definitely still got a community feel. This is when Italy won the Euros this past summer. They, you know, screen it on a sheet in the main piazza, and every, you know, it's definitely a community feeling. But this photo pretty much captures the people. That's most of the people that live in the village. It's very small, but as you can see, very beautiful. And it's sad because there's just all these places that are becoming abandoned. And I'm sure you've read articles about, oh, Italy's, you know, selling these houses for €1 that you can go and buy and then fix up, or you know, this small town in Italy will pay you to go live there. So my project was to go and see, well, are those projects working? You know, is that actually bringing people there? Because it's not an easy place to live. It's very beautiful, but there's no, for example, the roads are not well maintained. There's no internet, there's no heat. People there, this is what the roads look like in the town, right? So you can't, this is where, you know, people park at the bottom. And as you can see, it's really beautiful, and it's got, you know, so much history that should be preserved. That castle is from the 1300s, still perfectly, well, pretty much perfectly preserved on the outside, and, you know, the inside's very beautiful as well, but you can't really drive in these streets, and it's a whole straight up and down mountain. The village is literally built into the mountain, as you can see. So people carry wood in the winter from the bottom of the mountain and walk all the way up and carry it to their houses to heat it. And so a lot of what I was hearing from people is their frustration that, you know, it's not something that these towns can solve on their own in terms of having the services to provide people to bring them there. You know, like if, you know, so you read an article and say, oh, I'd love to go buy, you know, this house. Okay, it's falling apart, but it's €1. And I have, you know, these wealthy Americans who say, okay, I'll buy it and fix it up. But 1 or 2 families there is not going to improve the situations. There's, you know, no hospitals nearby. There's no schools nearby. And so it's very much a chicken and egg situation that's happening. That's, you know, where they get the wood to carry up on their backs to heat their homes in the winter. But it's a very chicken and egg situation that's happening because there's a struggle between, okay, well, you know, do we start by, you know, so we'll pay people to move there and open a business. But if a young family moves there and opens a business, you know, there's no place, oops, that's my alarm. There's no place for kids to go to school. You know, there's no place if you get sick, there's no really healthcare system. So it's definitely something that is not these programs that, and in these articles you read about programs to bring people there, it's not necessarily working, and the places that need the most help are definitely overlooked and not getting the services that they need. But there are people who are working to save it. You know, there are people who see value in terms of things that are, how we say in Italy is ben fatto, it's well made. So there's maybe in globalization and consumerism, of the kind of outside world of Molise. That's they're kind of losing things that are well made, and there's a history and culture that's unique to this region that people are working to preserve. And these are just some of the people that I talked to and had the privilege to meet while I was there, who are kind of working to preserve those traditions, and that could be a way to kind of bring people back. You know, we read about the future of farming, and it's not necessarily the way it used to be. It's young people who are, instead of inheriting a farm, they're choosing to move to the countryside with a shovel in one hand and a laptop in the other, and working to preserve organic food, to bring back heritage varieties. And so that's what a lot of the young people who chose to stay, or the young people who are starting projects like that, are kind of seeing more success. But there's a level of bureaucracy in Italy that's also kind of pushing back on these people in terms of their being able to carry out these projects. So definitely, I think, you know, instead of more top-down solutions, you know, there's all this money that the European Union and the Italian government has to help towns like this that are just, you know, being abandoned. But, you know, it's not necessarily the people who are leaving, it's not their fault, because these places are falling behind. So it's a combination of needing to have those services there, and also instead of making it easier for, you know, wealthy Americans to buy a house to move there, you know, who have ties there, you know, there's talk of, you know, rebuilding the houses already instead of people doing it themselves. And then you can bring in migrants or refugees, which is also a tricky topic in Italy right now. But the people who leave and come back and still see value in these places are trying to do that. And you can see here, I mean, this is a beautiful lake that no one knew about up until about 2 or 3 years ago. When this man pictured here started a business there in terms of eco-friendly tourism. So, you know, no motorboats on the lake, it's just kayaking or paddle boarding or something like that, to kind of bring people there, to kind of bring new life to Molise in a way that's not going to completely corrupt it or turn it into a tourist destination, to kind of preserve a more genuine part of Italy. And so I learned a lot about, you know, different initiatives that people who are from there and had traveled and saw, you know, got inspired and returned and are trying to save their home. So that's just kind of a broad overview, but definitely looking to talk more later.
Great, thank you, Emily, and you know, appreciating that the time extra time you use wisely. It sounded like, just to dig in and get some information before heading off. We'll turn to Taha now.
Hi, everyone. So I am a reporting fellow from Berkeley Center for Peace, Religion, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And I'm a 2021 reporting fellow for the Pulitzer Center that was reporting on the Sufi shrines in Indian-administered Kashmir. So before I started to conceive this project, I was really aware of my limitations, of my space, and of the time that I was really sort of going to invest in my field research. So I was in Qatar when I was applying for the fellowship, and I got it. But then I also had to keep in mind that I'm first dealing with a really vulnerable population that are under constant surveillance by the Indian state. So any attempts that I make to sort of contact them or record them or take pictures of them will not be very much welcomed, and it'll be really unethical, because I'm not an expert on tech and I cannot vouch for my data to be protected. So I had to go in. I had to go into my field towards the end of the summer in the month of July, because India was dealing with the second wave of COVID-19 and most of the flights coming from India were banned. So I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know if you guys can see it. So the piece that I'm writing for the Pulitzer Center is called Faith in Pandemic in Indian Occupied Kashmir. I mean, it has taken such an interesting turn, because when I first proposed the project, I was looking at how these Sufi shrines, particularly I'm looking at 3 Sufi shrines in Srinagar, acted as a place of healing and peace building. But when Pulitzer Center sort of disclosed the information about my project, I got a lot of, I faced a lot of critical sort of backlash from scholars or Kashmiris themselves who sort of like took my idea of peace building as that the narrative that, you know, people who ascribe to those Sufi shrines are somehow good Muslims and people who don't ascribe to those Sufi shrines are bad Muslims, and that this is the division that the Indian state has been trying to create since couple of decades. But when I went into my field and when I spoke to people there, first and foremost, the first challenge that I faced was getting these people to open up because they had been through so much. So these are some of the phrases and quotes that that when I was, you know, looking through my notes, it stayed with me. So the first, this was one of the caretakers at the Mukdum Sahib Shrine, which is located in the downtown of Srinagar, said that, you know, my livelihood is gone. I can barely meet the everyday expenses of my family, which was so interesting because these places are often seen as religious and not as like economic spaces. But for some people, these are their sole source of income, and I'll say more about that later. Then one of the visitors said that, you know, dealing with trauma and loss is getting harder with my peer being caged. So peer is a indigenous Kashmiri term that we use for like Sufi saints who are either buried in those shrines or in whose names these shrines are constructed. And then one more person said that I haven't prayed Jummah. Jummah is the auspicious Friday prayers properly in over a year, and I feel lost. So why these three things, why these like phrases matter and why this story matters is uh, is because Sufism has played a really important role in Indian University of Kashmir. And before, like in the history of, before in the existence of India or Pakistan, there were those like Silk roads that passed through Kashmir and the greater Himalayas, through which these Sufi peers came from all around the world. But most importantly, they came from Central Asia. They came from the steppe, which is like, you know, the Russian steppe of the Caucasus, and they traveled to Kashmir. And the earliest recorded date that I could find was 13th century. But for sure, I know before 13th century as well, these Sufi peers would come to Kashmir. Some Sufi peers stayed in Kashmir and some went back, but each one of them sort of impacted the religious landscape of Kashmir in their own unique way, because you could find early indigenous dharmic traditions were originated in Kashmir, Buddhist traditions originated in Kashmir, and then Islam also came to Kashmir through via the Silk Road. So what indigenous Kashmiris did, and why I'm using the word Kashmiris, say more about it later, constructed these shrines in the name of these Sufis, people who visited there or people who are even buried in Kashmir. Now, these Sufi shrines play a really important role in the fundamental social landscape of Kashmir. These are places of healing and these are places of resistance. And every year there is an annual Urs. Urs is either the sort of the death anniversary of the saint, or either the birth anniversary of the saint is celebrated in these shrines. And people in large swaths flock to those shrines to celebrate this auspicious day. These shrines are also spaces of expression, freedom, and harmony. And that's why I use the term Kashmiris, because these shrines have no regulations of, you know, that you have to be a Muslim to enter those shrines. That's not a thing in Kashmir. You can be a Hindu, you can be a Buddhist, you can be an atheist, you can be anyone, and you are welcome into these shrines, because these shrines are essentially spaces where people come together. There's a sense of community. And that's why I want to go back to, you know, my first slide, where one of the visitors was saying that, you know, I feel lost. I am not able to connect. I'm not able to connect to the wider community there. And the way you sort of connect to other people is when you pray with them, when you sort of visit those shrines together and are in the same space, because physical intimate space matters. So moving on, what happened during pandemic and why I have titled this Pandemic and Pandemonium is because the Indian state revoked Article 370 under the leadership of Narendra Modi in August 2019. I know Zainab spoke a little bit more about it, and that sort of revoked the special status of Kashmir and put Kashmir under a lockdown. There was a communication blackout, there were the flights were suspended, and mobility was cramped. So a lot of people weren't able to travel here and there, and these Sufi shrines acted as a place where where people could deal with a trauma like that, because this trauma is immense, it's insurmountable for certain people, and it has far-reaching consequences. So when Kashmir was dealing with this pandemic, when Kashmir was dealing with one lockdown that started in August 2019, the first case of COVID-19 was reported in early March 2020. And Kashmir was coming out of one lockdown, and then another lockdown began with COVID-19. But this time around, this lockdown was a little different, because what Indian state managed to do was they managed to exercise a very insidious form of control and surveillance that was missing from these spaces. So essentially, religious spaces, and to sort of like not to violate any religious like morals or religious like principles, Indian state and the security forces used to stay away from these spaces, and these spaces were just for people. There was no regulation, anyone could come, and there was a sheer diversity of expressions, feelings that one could really sense in those shrines. But when I went to Kashmir this July and I spoke to the caretakers and visitors and actually visited those shrines, all these photos have been taken by me through my phone illegally. What I could see was a very eerie emptiness that is so alien to those spaces. Because these prayers in those Sufi shrines were banned. Usually all the shrines hold congregations. They hold they pray 5 times during a day in large congregations. People from the neighborhood all around the place who are even visiting Srinagar come to those shrines to pray, but prayers were banned. For the first time, when I went to Hazratbal, the picture that you're seeing on the screen is the Hazratbal Dargah, which is one of the auspicious shrines where people pray. There were security forces placed outside the gates of shrines, and they asked for my ID. They took away my phone, and they asked me that not to take any pictures, and only certain number of people were allowed inside, which was so new to these places where there were no regulations, there were no security forces, there were no labels placed on people who could come. But now there was security all around, and there was a path that you could just go in, pray, and come out. You cannot roam the shrine, you cannot talk to other people, and you have to wear masks all the time. Apart from that, congregations in all 3 major shrines were banned, and only certain number of people were allowed. Why I am sort of emphasizing on the word congregation is because congregation is not like a monolithic, homogeneous type of a thing, because people in those shrines do charity. There are like poor people who cannot meet their everyday expenses, who are like, just sitting outside, waiting for people to either give them cash, to give them food, so that they could meet their everyday sort of expenses. And that's why I just want to go back to the 3 sort of like phrases that I like took out from my notes. There are hundreds of such phrases, and that's why I want to really sort of emphasize that how these shrines and how the closing and clamp down on those shrines have had different effects on people from all parts of Kashmir. It doesn't matter what gender you are, what class do you belong to, these shrines played a really important part in your life. And yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing all of that, and also the fact that how you had to shift and what else happened. So I'm hopeful we'll have more questions on that conversation too. So we are halfway through. We have 3 more fellows to present during our afternoon session. So we're going to move on to Hannah.
Okay, so my name is Hannah Lilly, and I'm going to be presenting on my topic for my story, which is Indigenous Filipinos Reclaiming Ancestral Territory. And so the main focus of my story is on the Bagobo of Mindanao. And so this is a tribe that has ultimately been a part of the indigenous community of Mindanao for ultimately the longest time. They are ultimately one of the first groups of indigenous peoples to occupy the area. And so they have a long-rooted amount of tradition that is rooted back to their ancestral homeland. My reporting initially, I had hoped to be able to go to the Philippines. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the rise of the Delta variant across Asia, especially in the Philippines, I ultimately decided it wasn't going to be a very feasible opportunity for me to go and interact with my contacts. Also, vaccine rollout is pretty slow in the Philippines currently. So due to these circumstances, I ultimately decided that remote reporting would be probably the safest and most feasible. However, as many of my other fellows have talked about, remote reporting is not the easiest. I definitely have had my fair share of contacts who have dropped or like claimed earlier that they would be interested and then had difficulty of like communicating, as well as issues in like time zones and those type of things. So remote reporting is not the easiest, but I think also due to the circumstances of the pandemic, it's sometimes the only really option that you can do. I ultimately became interested in this topic because my family is from Davao. I have family that lives in the Philippines currently, like still, and I've been to Davao City multiple times where my family lives. And each time I go, as well as communicating with my family members, I'm always interested in how urbanization, as well as ultimately like the development of the city has been. And so I was thinking about what communities, particularly minority communities, are affected because of ultimately people taking over land, especially with the government, and indigenous people were the main people who were affected by this. And so the Bagobo were one of the tribes that I decided to look into. And they're located in the upper Pulangi region near the Davao rivers, closer towards Mount Apo. And I'm going to show a map in one of my coming slides of where that is. But they are originally a nomadic tribe. They were hunter-gatherers that mainly focused on like the land and the forest region. And they have around over 4,000 square miles of land area, which is also considered 38% of it is public domain. And the remaining land is timberland. So this is this goes into the main issue of ancestral domain, where a lot of corporations have started to encroach on the land of these indigenous people, mainly because of resource extraction. So the map on the left shows an overall view of the Philippines, but the arrow points over here to this red region, which is the focus of where the Bagobo are, which is in Davao City. And so this is where the tribe is located. So the main issue at hand that I'm going to be looking at in my reporting is ancestral domain versus private corporations. And so there's a plethora of different issues that are involved, but the main aspect that is involved is the lack of legal documentation. Land rights, like the United Nations actually reports that land rights is law, but not in reality. There's only a few countries that truly recognize indigenous people's land rights. And even in those countries, demarcation procedures have not yet been fully completed, and they suffer delays, particularly because of lack of political leadership, as well as policies involved. Customary ownership is how most of these indigenous people are able to access their land, but many government authorities don't recognize that. They only recognize a fraction of the land being legally belonging to these indigenous people, particularly because since these indigenous people have lived on that land for so long of a period, there is no real legal documentation that proves they are the true owners of the land. And so as a result, many corporations, particularly involving in logging, energy, and mining, have been able to take control of the ecological landscape. They've destroyed mountains, forestry, to ultimately tap into the region's gold, copper, and nickel resources. Local leaders who ultimately have been corrupted may welcome investors to the sale of these ancestral land to generate wealth. And due to limited documentation, there is a true issue of land ownership, of knowing who are the true settlers, making the indigenous people viewed as informal settlers. And so the Bagobo are ultimately entangled in this issue where you have major corporations with a lot of leeway taking over the land. Encroachment has also left a lot of the native farmers without land to till, there's fewer opportunities for employment because agriculture is their main subsistence and how they gain their livelihood. And so as a result, there have been some of the community members I was able to talk to have stated that some of them have decided to end up working for these corporations as laborers due to there not really being any other option to gain their livelihood. Climate change is another aspect that has deteriorated this issue as a lot of the tribe's agricultural lifestyle has been affected due to irregular and heavy rain, creating landslides. The unpredictability of the rainy season has made it where farmers aren't really sure when to plant their crops. And so there's a lot of different issues associated with the land in that. Furthermore, there's constant exposure to pesticide spraying, which has destabilized not only the environment, but also created some health and sickness among the members. There's also inadequate access to resources being viewed as a minority status for the Indigenous people. And so there is lack of access to equal social services like healthcare and education that ultimately reduces their values. And a lot of the interviewees stated that there have been government proposals to help the situation, but there's ultimately a lack of the government's initiative to fulfill the projects. The funding management for the projects is overseen by the government, but in reality, it doesn't always go towards the people who need it or the beneficiaries that really truly need the aid and support. And so as a result, it's hard to evaluate if these projects are truly successful if the Bagogo themselves are not the ones directly involved in how the government is working to alleviate this situation. And so my outreach has been focused primarily on the Bagobo tribe members. However, I'm also currently working towards outreach towards aid groups and organizations that are working to alleviate the situation alongside the Bagobo. I'm also looking into activists who could possibly provide insight into what's going on in the local area and what they're doing to promote the cause. And then I also want to gain lawyer perspectives, perhaps from like universities in the Philippines, for lawyers who are who study ancestral domain and land rights, particularly looking at what has the Philippine government done over the years and its history of protection of Indigenous people. And so analyzing that from the historical perspective, I think would provide strength to my article. And so I have a quote on the left side from one of my contacts. Her name is Bae, and she is a Bagobo representative in the tribe. And she states, "We are fighting for our rights to preserve our land and culture. Equality never existed with land rights. And until now, it is deprived of everything. Welfare is just on paper." And I think that this quote really highlights the main issue in that their livelihood and their culture is ingrained into the land. And taking that away strips them of a lot of their human rights and access to resources. And just as she states, welfare is just on paper. While government may try to alleviate the situation, it doesn't always truly take into account the needs of the people themselves, leaving them ultimately still in the same situation where they are fighting for their rights to access their land. And so the key takeaways that I really want to gain from this, from my publication of this story, is that there needs to be a greater access and accountability to the protection of rights. There's ultimately a lack of legal protection for Indigenous people and their land. And so better justice systems, as well as the role of government, is necessary. Culture and religious identity are also tied to the land. And so without their land, the Bagobo lack the traditional agricultural practices that they have practiced for centuries. And ultimately, the Bagobo also view nature as a religious identity. So taking away their land also reduces a lot of their cultural rights that are ingrained part of that, part of their culture. And so lack of economic opportunities, access to resource, as well as human rights all play a role in this issue among land. And so it not only just affects one specific area in Davao, but also amongst all other Filipino tribes. As I was doing my research and looking at different Filipino tribes I could possibly analyze and use as my focal point, a lot of Indigenous communities in the Philippines are experiencing similar issues of having their rights and what they ultimately what they deserve taken away from them. And so as a result, what I hope to achieve from my Pulitzer reporting is that greater protection of Filipino Indigenous communities is necessary and needed.
Thank you, Hannah. And thanks for all that pre-reporting. I know in the chat earlier, you said one of the places you want to go is the Philippines to finish your project. So we wish you well on that. Also just want to say, as questions are bubbling up, if you're writing them down, feel free to put your name in the chat. And then I can call on you once we get done with our next two presenters. So Leanne, you're up next.
Okay. What happened there? Sorry. Try it this way. There we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm pleased to be here today. And I too would like to thank the Pulitzer Center for this opportunity to work on something that I'm very passionate about. I would also like to point out that they gave me some flexibility as well. I was supposed to present on Friday, and you'll see as I go through my presentation that this is really more kind of environmental focused. But I hope you'll also pick up on the fact that there's definitely some human rights elements to this story as well. So I think it equally fits into this topic area. So my project involves freshwater mussel restoration being conducted by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. The tribe's eventual goal is to restore freshwater mussels and other aquatic species such as salmon to Western waters because it is as part of their first foods philosophy, which is a cultural approach to natural resource management that's informed by the tribe's traditional food sources. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I chose this topic because freshwater mussels are one of the most endangered animals in North America, and many species have already become extinct. But as someone who spent 22 years working in natural resource management, I found the tribe's first food-centered approach very intriguing and unique. And so the reason I wanted to focus on the tribe's efforts with freshwater mussels in particular was because they are a relatively obscure species when you're talking about endangered species in general. So this shows where the reservation is. It's east of Pendleton, Oregon. But what I really wanted to point out with this slide is the tribes have been in this area, in a larger area for 10,000 years that goes north to Canada, west to the coast, south to California, Nevada, and east to Wyoming and Montana. And while the reservation under the Treaty of 1855 was about 172,000 acres, they traditionally have used these areas and moved around in a seasonal pattern to hunt and gather and collect foods, including mussels. Okay. Okay, sorry, I skipped a slide accidentally. Okay, in the West, the CTUIR has done more work than any other agency, including state or federal agencies, in terms of documenting mussels. And this shows the mussel populations in the various subbasins. And there are fewer species in the West than there are in some other areas of the country, but their historic range and prevalence was a lot greater historically. So this is very important work, and it's kind of the first step, because by documenting where the mussels are and what their range is, they can document further declines and document if there's a risk of extinction. The CTYR is working actually with the advocacy group called the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, which is based in Portland. So they both co-managed the database that was the foundation of the data that produced this map. The mussels have a very fascinating life cycle, and it's kind of important to talk about that just a little bit. They rely on the female mussel. Actually, the male mussel releases sperm into the water column, and the female takes it in through her siphon, and then the larvae form, and she releases those larvae, and they attach to a host fish, and the host fish they stay in on the host fish in a parasitic relationship that doesn't harm the fish for a period of weeks to months, depending on the species, and then they drop off to the bottom of the stream and become juveniles, and they begin life independently. But the reason I mention that is because that is part of the reason it's so complex to try to restore mussels, and it's very tricky. And the other reason I mention that is because salmonids are one of the host fish, and so their populations also impact the ability of mussels to be successful in reproducing. So I'll talk a little bit more about salmon efforts later as well. So mussel populations across the country are declining for many reasons, including climate change, impacts to water resources, man-made stream alterations such as channelization and dams, and of course, water pollution. So this, historically, the tribes have used mussels, the meat, of course, they ate, and then they used the shells as to make tools and jewelry. So this is an historic photo that I obtained from the Washington Historical Society that shows tribal members wearing the shell necklaces, which they don't make these anymore because there's not mussels to make them with, but there are some that are still in existence that are handed down from generation to generation. And of course, they're very prized by the tribal members. So the idea of first foods is connected to the tribe's creation story. The animals and plants that presented themselves to the people in a certain order, and they offered themselves as sustenance to the people in return for the people protecting them. So it's this philosophy of reciprocal care, and that's a lot of what drives the tribe's interest in restoring these under this first foods philosophy. And this order that the animals and plants presented themselves also informs the order in which the foods are served in a traditional meal. So it's very integrally connected to their cultural practices. So colonization by white European settlers obviously had drastic impacts on the Native American cultural practices. Where the Native American mindset was to have a sustainable and communal use of resources, the white European settlers' approach was more about property ownership and resource extraction for the benefit of personal use. So I find this photo to be somewhat an apt metaphor for that, because this overlooks the tribal lands, and I was there during the summer, during the heat wave. And so this shows the parched landscape and the effects of climate change. And you can see the haze in the air there from the wildfires that occurred throughout the summer. And then the plant in the foreground there is common teasel, which was actually introduced by white European settlers, and now has become a noxious invasive species. So the process of actually restoring mussels starts with surveying them and documenting them, as I mentioned, and it's a very labor-intensive process. This is Christine O'Brien. She's a contractor that works with the tribe. She's literally crawling through a tributary to the Tucannon River here and feeling on the bottom of the stream for mussels, and that's how she's counting them. So you can imagine the time and resources that it takes to actually document these populations. And this is Alexa Main. She actually is a tribal employee. She's not a tribal member, but she works for the tribe. She is the fisheries biologist and also the lead on the mussel restoration program. So here she's actually, the water's deep enough, she's actually able to snorkel, but she has to literally pull herself over the rocks very carefully and count the mussels again individually. So again, just a very labor-intensive process, but very important to document the trends in these mussels over time. And here's the actual mussels in the stream. This is in the John Day River. And if you look closely at the top there of the mussels, you can see the siphon. That's where they draw in the water that they filter to get their food. They can filter up to 10 gallons of water per day. So you can imagine if you had a large mussel bed, the positive impact that could have on water quality. But you can also imagine if there's a lot of sediment or pollution in the water, how it can actually affect the mussels and is not good for the health of the mussels. This is Alexa again, and this is the wet lab at the Walla Walla Community College Water and Environment Center. So Alexa is in the process of building a mussel propagation facility. Right now, there's actually already a lamprey propagation facility. That's another first food that the tribe is trying to restore. And that's what she's inspecting right there. But if you see in the background, part of the mussel restoration facility or the mussel propagation facilities. So eventually they're wanting to propagate mussels so that they can actually place them back in the stream in the hopes of restoring and supplementing existing populations. As I mentioned earlier, dams have had a big impact, and there's a lot of hydroelectric dams in the Columbia River Basin run by the Bonneville Power Administration. So this is the Bonneville Dam, and the Northwest Power Act of 1980 provided funding to mitigate some of the fish and wildlife impacts of the dam system. And one of the things that they've done is build fish ladders. So as I mentioned, salmonids are one of the host fish for the Western species of mussels. So as many of you probably know, salmonids are anadromous fish, meaning they spend most of their lives in the sea, but then they have to travel upstream in freshwater to spawn. So the dams obviously impeded their ability to do that. So they built these fish ladders, and fish actually jump up these steps of this ladder to make their way upstream to spawn. And this is just a little closer up picture where you can actually see the salmon making progress up the ladder. This Northwest Power Act provides funding for this mitigation. Also, it provides a lot of the resources for the CTYR efforts in natural resource management, including the mussel program. In fact, one of the employees of the tribe who oversees these efforts said it's basically the lifeblood of their program. So the tribe is in the process of developing a master plan. I thought I had one more slide, but it's not coming up. They're in the process of developing a master plan that looks out over the next several decades. Actually, this is a long-term process, which is another one of the challenges, because it's hard to show short-term progress. So that makes it harder for them to actually get resources to do this work. But it does involve, like I said, this first foods philosophy and this very holistic approach to natural resource management that's intricately tied to their cultural resources. And they have these treaty rights to use their traditional use areas to do hunting, fishing, and gathering, but the treaty rights are not very meaningful if there's not resources there to actually collect. So it's definitely, in my mind, a human rights issue as well as an environmental issue. So in closing, I think the one thing I would note is I think that this tribal approach to natural resource management is very unique, and I think that we as Western or the federal government and the states would have a lot to learn from the tribes about this more holistic approach to management. And I thank you for your attention today, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Leanne, and glad you were able to join us today. And now, Rita.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me and listening to my presentation. And I will share my screen. So it's great to be a part of this conference, just hearing what a lot of people said about the challenges with trying to figure everything out with your projects going because of the pandemic. I'm actually a 2020 reporting fellow, and so I heard about being recipient of this fellowship right at like the height of the pandemic. So my journey, it's been a big journey with this project. I actually had to switch my original location, which was going to be in Sydney, Australia, looking at Aboriginals, but Australia had a travel ban for a really long time, and I was trying to like be hopeful about it. And I started like a master's program. So I had like different challenges of getting started. But now I'm excited because more recently I still wanted to be in like the human rights kind of more like mindset. And now I'm looking at culture and I'm focusing more so on language, because I think that culture or that language is like a big driver of culture, just as how people connect and how people are able to communicate with one another. And through language, that's where you learn about how like different things come to be, and that's how we got like different like mathematics and botany, and not everything always translates from language to language. So the title of my project as of right now is preserving culture through language. And so the new location of my project now is Accra, Ghana. I have not been able to travel to Ghana for some of the reasons that people have said that haven't been able to travel to their country. Like the vaccination rollout is pretty low. And I just kind of wanted to see how things turn out before I travel to this location. I'm just following like CDC recommendations and the like State Department updates and what their country says. But I picked Ghana just because I had an interest in it. And it's one of the safer countries to travel in West Africa. And that was also a concern as like my security and safety traveling as like an individual. But I'm really excited because like this Ghanaian culture is like really rich and a lot of like popular culture that I follow now. So I'm hoping to be able to complete this project there soon. And what kind of drove me to look at language. So the biggest thing is when I say preserving language, I want to look at is there language loss, or are people really sticking to kind of like their ethnic language, because the official language of Ghana is English due to colonization, but there's so many different ethnic groups, and there's like 50 plus indigenous cultures in Ghana, and a lot of the like ethnic groups are dying off because there's one ethnic group that's like 47.5% of Ghanaians fall under like that group, and so a lot of people will actually abandon like smaller ethnic languages to speak this ethnic language, which is called Akan. And so part of my project is that I'm hoping to see if people are like abandoning their language to learn this greater ethnic language, or are they abandoning their language to solely speak English? Since English is like the medium level of instruction, and that's mainly how most people communicate, just because there's different like ethnic groups and like not everybody speaks the same language. So English is usually kind of that bridge. And me looking to go to the city, you're going to see English being spoken a lot more widely. So that's part of my intended lessons. I also want to look at like, is there still a sense of community since English is the official language? I'd assume that there's many like Western influence and how people are being educated. And so I want to see that like if a native language isn't being really taught for a long time at schools, will people kind of also adopt more Western cultures and behaviors, or do they still keep what they learn in the household about their like ethnic culture, or do they kind of adopt more so what they're learning in school? And along my research, I found that there was actually a program that was started in about like a 2010 with UNICEF, and they were trying to like kind of like the government has like 11 ethnic languages that are like approved to be taught in school, but it's only taught from like grades kindergarten to 4th grade. And so after that, it's solely English. And so I was curious about, does learning a native language at an early age and abandoning it at school at still in your primary education, does that affect how you, like, does that affect how you form a relationship with like your community and like your culture, or does it kind of like disrupt your learning? And like, does it matter if you go to a private school? Is this still enforced versus a public school? And that's why I'm excited to still try to go to the country and not just do it virtually, because I haven't found a lot of information about this government program online. And from some of the sources that I've been talking to, they've all had different experiences. And so it's not really clear to me. And I feel like if I could meet people just like organically, maybe then I could like learn what it's like for each household, because I also do think it's not like education plays a big role in it, but also like your parents and their upbringing, and like what you learn if like your grandparents and cousins live with you, because a lot of African cultures, I'm told that people live like the home unit is not just nuclear, meaning like you live with just your parents and your siblings. It's usually kind of generations, or you kind of live in a compound where the whole family and extended family live really near each other. So, I mean, if that's the case, then maybe culture is not being lost. And so these are all questions that I'm excited to dig deep and like learn about. And this topic is really interesting to me, just because I feel like Indigenous cultures are something that we talk about a lot, but we're not really sure how to kind of minimize losing extinction. And everywhere it's being really extinct, especially for like a multilingual country. And so I really want to explore more about people's identity and how language plays a role in that. And so right now I've been in contact with a student and a professor in linguistics, and they've been kind of really helpful to tell me like how the situation is going and talk about their own experience. Like the professor, she is married to somebody who's Ghanaian, but he doesn't speak the same language as her. And so that's a challenge that they face, that so they don't speak their native languages to their children, and they don't really know that. And then also like with the student that I'm talking to, he doesn't know another language, he just knows English, and he doesn't really live that close to his extended family. So he kind of feels like there's more of like that Western influence. And they're both really interested in connecting me with other people. So I think the project will be fruitful, and I'll be able to answer all these questions and kind of share their stories and hopefully shed light to everybody about the importance of emphasizing, like remembering like your background and how that shapes you, and why preserving language is like really important to culture. And yeah, so that's kind of what I've been working on, and I'm trying to remain patient and hopefully be able to complete the progress like a lot of you guys have been able to do. And thank you for letting me share what I've been working on and what I'm hoping. And yeah, looking forward to continue having discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita. And we'll get to questions, because I'm sure may want to ask even more questions about how some of your colleagues undertook their reporting, not only from this panel, but I know there are other reporting fellows here. And so folks do drop your names into the chat if you have questions for any of our fellows who presented during this session. But first, I've been advised that we need to take a group session picture before we get into the Q&A. So if you are able to turn on your cameras, I'll give it a moment, and then we'll all take some shots here. And those who don't want to turn on the camera, I leave that to you. So in 3, 2, 1, in a moment, I will now go. So smile. we'll take one more. Chris, you took off your hat, I think, or something. You did something there. Well, thank you all for that photo that we're gonna attach somewhere, I think on our website, or just to share out with all of you. But I do want us to get to some questions. We have just about 20 minutes left. And I know, as I said before, it's been a long day for a lot of you, all of you who've joined in for these sessions, and want to first turn to our presenters. If they have, the six of you, if you have questions of each other, some of you have traveled, some of you are still hoping to travel. And I know some of the questions came in terms of how do people work through unknown timelines. I think, Rita, you may have put that in the chat before. So if any of our presenters have questions or comments for each other, I want to open the door for that now. Just raise your hand or just unmute.
I have a question for Emily. First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. It really reminded me when I was reading those articles on CNN about people, like just the opportunity to like go to Italy if you want to like move there and they'll pay you. So that was definitely recent that I remember. And like you talked about not having like schools and like hospitals nearby. So I was wondering if you came across a lot of small children and how they were like impacted. And also were a lot of the locals you met like people that have lived there for generations, and were they trying to leave, or like would they like if they had the opportunity to leave, would they leave, or would they choose to stay?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, so it was crazy while I was there. I mean, I was there for about 3 weeks, but I saw, I think, the same 5 children running around, kicking a soccer ball around. And then, you know, these days they're, you know, trying to work the one smartphone they have to see if they can get on TikTok, which is crazy to see, like in the middle of nowhere as well. You know, it's like the same things. But yeah, no, it was very strange to see a place, you know, quite so isolated. And it's, you know, like I learned, like walking down the street, by the end of the 3 weeks, I could name everyone, you know, and it was, it's very surreal to kind of see these places, these houses just crumbling down and being left. But it's really sad. A lot of the young people I talked to, I went during the summer because Italy kind of has a break at the end of July, beginning of August, where everyone just kind of goes home for a little bit. And so people were kind of coming back to where their roots are to have a break from the city or wherever they were working. And a lot of the young people are a lot of the people with ambition and, you know, like drive to really do something. They all had to leave because, you know, there's really not a way to do it there. And the local government, you know, wants to do something to help, but they don't have the resources themselves to build up broadband or to fix the roads. And so they're kind of relying on a lot of bureaucracy. And so that's the other thing that a lot of young people face there, is there are people who have ideas, you know, and have, you know how it's very, I think other people have talked about this too, you know, it's instead of being something that's so top down, each community knows what their individual community needs. But the bureaucracy in Italy is, you know, it takes a real special person to kind of climb that mountain of bureaucracy and paperwork just to get anything done, even if they have an idea. So that was definitely a challenge that they faced, and you could see it in the frustration of the people. But I think, you know, being there, they were, you know, kind of shocked to see an American there, and, you know, were definitely curious at first why I was there and asking a lot of questions and kind of wondering what was really going on. And then, you know, once they learned that I actually did care about them and, you know, wanted to, and my family was there and I wanted to kind of tell this story, then they were very open in talking about the challenges that they were facing. So just kind of, I think, connecting on that level, taking the time to answer all of their questions, and they learned who I was and they saw who I was in person, I think made a really big difference.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Rita. Any other questions from our presenters to each other? Or I will also open up the floor. Stephanie?
Oh, thank you. I have a question for Steina. I was curious. First, I love what you said about approaching the sources or your sources more as human than journalist. And I wanted to know a little bit more about your experience building relationships with the people that you're expecting or hoping to collaborate that are on site as you work remotely.
Thank you, Stephanie. I tried contacting them first as journalists, but they were like really not comfortable talking because they were like, we have been hounded by journalists all across and they just come to us for story, but then they leave. So I had to approach them like, hey, I'm a Kashmiri too. And I was there when this clampdown happened. And I left 5 days after this lockdown. And I had absolutely no idea how my family is doing, how my partner is doing, what what condition they are in. They could not get to me. I could not even get to say goodbye. So like I had to open up with them, and then they like slowly they started opening up. But like that happened in approximately 7 or 8 calls. Like I had to call them every twice a week and stuff, and they would be like, they would sometimes just talk about their art and not talk. Sometimes they would say we're busy. Sometimes they would be too reluctant to talk, or they would also be against the idea of me doing this project. They were like, why, like, who cares about us? So there's that, because they have been through so much. So I think if you're trying to collaborate with people, especially like people who are living in conflict zone and they have been through so much, it's always a good way to approach them with your own story, so that maybe they can they can trust you better. And that also happened with me when I was interviewing this artist from Palestine for a class project. And he did all the background check on me, and then he figured out I'm from Kashmir, and then he was like, okay, like we share a similar story, so I can talk to you. So I think it's very important, if you're trying to talk to somebody who has been through so much trauma, political, emotional, and also like it's such a tough time right now. It's important to talk to them not as journalists. I mean, I know we are journalists, our first instinct is to jump at them with questions, but it's always better if we try to ease them into it. I mean, if that answers your question, Stephanie.
Yes, thank you so much. And the reason I asked is because I struggle in a similar way with my own project. So it's because they've been through so much trauma, how do you assure that this is a safe space for them to, talk about their stories with you? You are like safe space, or you're providing a safe space. So
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think this issue of how do you have individuals open up to you, but also protect and be sensitive and protect them. I know we've had this discussion on a couple of other sessions. So if there's anyone else who wants to share a tip or a takeaway or a concern or a resource, please feel free to share onward to here at this moment.
So, Anne, it's John.
Yep.
I'd share one thought on that, the point about sort of what you were just saying about coming to people not as a journalist but as a human. I would say in defense of journalism that it would be what you're really talking about. What all of you have done is you've approached people not only as humans but as good journalists, and so that is good journalism. So the kind of gotcha approach, or they're parachuting in and walking into a community or a neighborhood or a person's house and immediately bombarding them with questions, that's not good journalism. It often passes for journalism, but it's not what we aspire to, and it's not how you get the best story. It's not how you understand and get closer to the truth. And what's so exciting about these projects, and I've really enjoyed listening to all of them, and I look forward to seeing what else comes from them, is because you've done just that. I mean, you've gone at this with a real respect for the people and the complexity of the issues that you're covering. So thank you all.
Thank you, John. we've got a bit more time. Other questions or thoughts? Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually have a question for Zainab. I noticed I know that this isn't necessarily a journalism question, but I noticed a really interesting photo on one of your slides of a shirt, and I was trying to read the caption for your presentation. Would you mind sharing a little bit of the story behind that photo? Because I think it's a really compelling photo based on what I could read from the caption.
Oh, yeah, it's a shirt of the journalist who was detained for 9 months. And for 6 months, he was not allowed to meet his family or get any extra set of clothing. So he was detained wearing one t-shirt and a trouser, and he kept washing it and he kept wearing it. So there were like holes. So that t-shirt has like some 38 holes in it. And that he kept wearing it for 6 months while it was like super cold, super chilly. So he has kept it as a memory of what occupation can do to you. And he shared that t-shirt of me, like the photo of the t-shirt, saying this is my memory of the jail. So yeah, that's the story behind the t-shirt.
That's really powerful, and a really powerful image.
I recall building on something John had said in terms of listening, and what we've also heard with some other panels. I recall one photojournalist as well, and you know, sometimes the photojournalist has to get that photo and move on. And on some longer pieces, he also said he never took out his camera until he had had conversations and was listening to the individuals involved with the stories he wanted to report on. So as we wind down, are there, and this is opening up to both our panelists for today and other fellows and others who have joined us, is there a takeaway that you want to share if you were, shall we say, your younger self before you embarked on this particular reporting opportunity, this project, that you would tell your younger self to watch out for, or to think about, or to get another resource on? And I can open it up. I'll give a moment to think, but maybe I can just start with folks kind of across the top. Oh, Taha, go ahead. We'll start with you and maybe go across the top a bit.
I mean, it's a complicated question to ask. You know, what would you say to yourself? Maybe something along the lines of, you know, how to navigate difficult situations, and with time it gets better, with more nuance and less sort of commodification of things, and more sort of really being in the moment and really listening to what people are saying. Even like conversations that were happening in shrines were so interesting that one could do a whole, like a doctoral dissertation on like what goes on in those shrines. So, but I managed to capture as much as all my 5 senses could, even the sound, the smell, the vision, the whole sort of performativity that was going on in these shrines really had a deep impact on me. And I have been visiting them since I was a really young child, but I never could sort of fathom everything. But going back for reporting and really having that sense of vision, that what do I want, really helped me. And also, like, I think one thing I think that I didn't mention in my presentation, but I did mention in my proposal, was how my family's last name gave me the privilege and access to certain spaces which are not accessible to any ordinary person. So my grandfather, who is a Sufi himself and is like sort of known in South Kashmir, so I had to say, okay, my last name is Bukhari, and you know, Bukhari connects me to a long lineage of people who I had really forgotten about, my ancestors who were Sufis, who came from Bukhara, Uzbekistan, and settled in Kashmir. That sort of gave me access to a whole new, different side of those shrines that I had not sort of encountered as of yet.
Thank you. Mira?
Yeah, so I guess I'll share one takeaway first from this presentation and then my piece of advice. But I think one thing I really enjoyed hearing was all of the different creative mediums you guys used to look at conflict, right? We saw language used today, art used today, Sufi shrines. Like there's so many unconventional and creative ways you guys approached conflict that really inspired me. And my sort of, I guess, piece of advice that I would tell my younger self or tell journalists would be that you should allow yourself room to be surprised in your reporting. You might think the story is one thing and it might turn out to be something completely different. I reported on the relationship between the innocence movement in the US and the prison abolition movement. And I'd done, some organizing in college and had worked in these spaces before and sort of had a hypothesis about what I was going to write about. And it turned out to be quite different. So I think go in with an open mind and allow yourself room to be surprised. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard that great piece of advice too. I've heard that. Emily, just I feel like we're playing musical boxes on my particular one because some people are leaving us. So Emily, you're up. Oh, and then Leanne.
Okay, yeah. So I, just have to echo what everyone else has said in terms of, letting your mind be open and do the research, but also, don't do so much that you're, writing it before you get there, and then your mind is kind of fogged up with preconceived notions of what you're going to be going in and reporting on, and trust that. I scheduled some interviews ahead of time, but I left a lot of open time. And Taha was kind of saying that too, to just go into the spaces and overhear conversations, because that's where you get the ideas to ask the right kind of questions when you do an official interview. So I would definitely recommend just walking without a camera, going and sitting in an open space where you can hear those conversations and get those ideas.
Leanne?
Yeah, so I have a mistake that I made that I'll share as a teachable moment. As when I was preparing to go out and visit, I worked with a scientist, Alexa Main, who I said is an employee of the tribe, but she's not a tribal member. And when I wanted to connect with some actual tribal members, and she passed that information along, I found out that there was a permit process that I needed to go through to do the research. And the permit process normally takes, they want to get a permit application 3 months in advance. And here I was a couple of weeks before I was scheduled to fly out to Oregon. And fortunately for me, the tribal member who was in charge of that process was very good to me, and he expedited the process for me. But the takeaway was, even though I knew that recognized tribes had their own government and they're a sovereign government and they have their own opportunities to create, the laws and processes, I did not do my due diligence. So, in the future, if I work again with recognized tribes here in the United States, I'll definitely keep that in mind and do a better job of research up front.
Right. Zainab, would you like to share any?
Yeah, I learned it the hard way, but I think it's very very important to separate your emotions from your work when you're doing it. Because when I started writing a script for my podcast, I was like, I cannot kill this goat, or I cannot kill this goat. And my advisor kept telling me, kill your darlings, kill your darlings. And I have lost count of how many darlings I had to kill. But yeah, I mean, it was just completely blocking the way I was looking at the story, because I was focusing on the quotes and wow, this was important, this was important. And then she had to tell me, like, make it a story. It is about you, but also not about you. So you have to separate yourself from the story and narrate the whole story. So yeah, that is one advice I would give to my younger self, to not put, to put yourself, but also to remove your emotions when you're doing the story.
Right. Hannah?
I think just to echo what everyone else has said, something I didn't really think about was really utilizing your mentor, because I was actually throughout the process, like initially in the beginning, I didn't really talk to my mentor a lot as much. But I realized during my calls, as I started like having more conversations with them, they're really valuable. They have like a ton of different experiences. And she also helped me narrow down like my scope at points when I was like feeling lost about like, I don't know where my contacts are, like they're all like dropping. She was really communicated with me. She also had connections with like Philippine reporters and journalists. And so she gave me a lot of access to resources that I would have not have gotten any other way. So I think utilizing the people around you is very valuable.
Yeah. And our last panelist, just Rita, handing to you if you have, I know you've had some trials and tribulations getting to where you are now. So any thoughts on what your advice to your younger self about a year ago might have been?
I think definitely like asking for help, like when you get stuck. I wish I would have taken I wish I would have been more proactive on it. I know it was like a different, like it was this unusual circumstance that like nobody knew what was going on, but not like pushing it to the side. And then talking more with like Kim or like Libby and like my mentor more often about like what's going on and like checking in, because it can be a lot to take it all on your own, even though it is an individual or independent project, but just kind of like reaching out to connections helped.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I know we're right at 5. This conversation, I'd love to hear from other folks, other fellows here, but I know you know each other's emails and exchanges, and hopefully we can continue this conversation, which has been really helpful. And I'm really glad I heard of your work. It's one thing to read your pieces and await your pieces, but also to hear the back, to learn what's inspiring you and some of the behind the scenes stories. Really thankful for that. A few reminders before we finally sign off for the evening. Hopefully you all have received a gift via Grubhub or some other entity that you can use to sustain yourselves this weekend. So please enjoy dinner or lunch or breakfast or a combination thereof on the Pulitzer Center. And we're looking forward to you joining us tomorrow morning for more of the Reporting Fellow workshops, starting with the first session at 10 a.m. We have 2 justice and human rights, or all things health. So with that, just want to wish you the best and to have a good rest of your day and beginning of your evening.